Waikato University. He has also done a book on New Zealand Muslims. It will be interesting thing to hear from him the history of New Zealand Muslims. So welcome, Abdullah Dururi. Please, it's your time.
Thank you very much, Abbas. Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh from New Zealand. The aim of my presentation today is to examine the history of Muslims in New Zealand within the overarching framework of the wider history of this country, and with particular focus on the cultural history of Islam here. Because it's first thing in the morning, I'll be reading from my notes, and I've got my cup of coffee. I'm half asleep. It is very early over here. To begin with, Muslims arrived in New Zealand with the Anglo-European settlement processes. The earliest Muslim visitors were South Asian sailors called Lascars. They were working on British and European vessels in the South Pacific. The majority of early Muslim settlers during the colonial period, especially from 1840 onwards, were drawn from or through British colonial interests in South Asia. A small but not insignificant minority, however, came from other areas in Asia, Africa, and Europe that were outside the British Empire. I believe that the one consistent feature of the wider Muslim community in New Zealand is the fact that it has always been made up of several overlapping, interactive, and evolving communities, and this can provide us some clues to the future prospects here in New Zealand. So, an overview to begin with, the cultural history of the Muslims in New Zealand. The first identifiable Muslims to visit this country came to Northland, which is in the far north province of this country, in December 1769. They were on board a French vessel that was exploring the coast. The first Muslim family arrived in 1854, within 20 years of the establishment of the British colony of New Zealand. This was a chap called Wazira and his wife and 4 sons. They lived in a place that was named Kashmir. He was working for a guy called Wazira was working for a guy called Sir John Craycroft Wilson, who was born in India to English parents, and he had retired from the Indian Civil Service in the British Empire, retired to the colony of New Zealand, and he brought out some Indian servants, including Muslim, Hindu, and so forth. And one of the families, as I said, was a Muslim family. Curiously, Wazira worked on transporting. Later in his life, he worked on transporting stones to a very famous church project in Christchurch. He died in 1902 and was described in the local newspapers as a venerable Indian, respected early settler. From the 1890s onwards, men from the Punjab and Gujarat regions of India started arriving in significant numbers. Many of them began working as hawkers and rural labourers, and then they started getting money together and running small shops in the rural provinces. Ultimately, a lot of them moved into our biggest city, Auckland. Some moved on to Australia, and a few settled. Some of these men married local women. Others kept wives and children back in India. For example, just to give you some concrete examples here, we have a guy called Ahad Baksh Malik, who arrived in 1890 from India and settled in Arrowtown, which, if you look on a map, is in the heart of Otago province in the far south of the South Island of New Zealand. He lived and worked in the region as a hawker to start with, and then he ran a small shop until his death in 1918. He was married to a European woman at one point, but they do not appear to have had any children. His funeral service was conducted by a Presbyterian minister, which means a lot in New Zealand because Otago is full of Presbyterians. It's full of Scottish settlers, for those of you who know British Isles history. Another interesting character, the only Muslim to appear in the official New Zealand dictionary biography, which is published by the New Zealand government, is a guy called Abraham Wali Muhammad Salman, who we assume was Ibrahim Wali Muhammad Suleiman. He came from the Punjab. He arrived before World War I. He married a European, had a daughter named Aisha. He was a businessman, very prosperous. When he died in New Plymouth, 1941, local newspapers reported that over 3,000 people attended his funeral, including the mayor. And that was at a time when New Plymouth only had about 10,000 people in the locale. And again, a very curious coincidence here, his funeral service was also conducted by a Presbyterian minister. At that time in New Zealand history, there was no mosques, no ulama, so there was a lot of interaction and goodwill between the peoples of different faiths. It's important to remember that not everyone who came to New Zealand was actually from India. And it's a little bit convoluted here, but stick with me. We have an example, 1894, a father and son from Turkmenistan, Saleh and Sultan Muhammad. They came from, they had fled the Russian invasion of Central Asia and settled in British India briefly before migrating to New Zealand 1903. 2 years later, in 1905, Sultan Muhammad died. His death was reported in the local newspaper, where he was described sympathetically as an old Assyrian. It's worth bearing in mind that in the old days in New Zealand, they weren't 100% sure where some of these immigrants and refugees were coming from. His son Saleh set up a popular ice cream business in Christchurch. He married a woman of Scottish heritage. They had 4 daughters, Rahana, Rupi, Tula, and Florence. The curious feature about that marriage certificate, though, was that Saleh Muhammad gave his place of birth as Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, which to me suggests that he thought it was important or better to emphasize some sort of connection with the British Empire. Saleh Muhammad became a very popular ice cream salesman of all things, and he was nicknamed Ice Cream Charlie, Charlie being an adaptation of Saleh in New Zealand. And he was so popular that his image was in the newspapers. He was considered to be a part of the local landscape in central Christchurch. He passed away in 1943. 1900s, one of my favourite historical anecdotes, which I like to relate to people. In 1907, there was a court case in Northland, up in the far north of New Zealand, where two gentlemen from Bosnia-Herzegovina were attending a court case as witnesses, and they were ordered by the judge to remove their fezzes. And the fez, as you recall, used to be very popular 100 years ago, the little red fez with the black tassel. And the Tata Bush, I think is the word, isn't it? So these 2 gentlemen complained to their consul, their diplomatic representative, because they were in fact foreigners working in New Zealand. They complained about having to remove their fez in a court of law. So their consul complained to the New Zealand Minister of Justice, and an official memorandum was released saying that Muslims in New Zealand were allowed to wear their fez in court. Now, just a little footnote to this curious incident, 1907. The 2 men were part of a group of 13 men from Herzegovina, Slavic-speaking Muslims. The Austrian Bosnia-Herzegovina was part of the Austrian Empire at the time, and so their consul was actually the consulate representative of the Kingdom of Austria-Hungary, and he was in fact actually a German immigrant, a Roman Catholic German immigrant who'd married an English woman. And the New Zealand Minister of Justice at the time was an Irishman, an Irish immigrant from a Protestant family. So you have the Catholics, the Protestants, and the Muslims from Bosnia-Herzegovina, Ireland, England, and Germany, representing Austria, all coming to discuss fezzes in a New Zealand court of law. I find that very amusing. Anyway, but presumably it makes it legal to wear a fez in the New Zealand court of law even today. A little useless footnote to the history of New Zealand, which is not well known. Another interesting biography, another interesting character here that I'll just mention very briefly before we move on to broader generalizations. There was a chap called Ahmed bin Reddy, also known to the authorities as Ali Muhammad, or sometimes Muhammad Ali. He was born in Oman, Muscat, to be precise. Apparently he worked for the British Navy as a stoker in the engine rooms before taking up similar work with New Zealand Railways. He ended up retiring to a place called Ashburton, which is just outside of Christchurch, in the 1930s, where he died in 1937. The National Archive in Wellington contained a fascinating 42-page naturalisation file with testimonials from the local police force saying what a good character this individual was. And I love the quote here. They said he had no communistic tendencies. Like a lot of the early immigrants, however, Ali Muhammad never married or had children that we know of. Now, back to the more broader generalizations here. From the 1930s onwards, some of the Muslim men who had worked in New Zealand as hawkers and shopkeepers from British India began to bring their sons out and occasionally wives and children. Now, after the 1947 partition of India, between India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, this process accelerated, and you had more and more of these families bringing out their families to the safety and security of New Zealand. And towards that end, in 1950, a group of Indian Muslim men from the Gujarat created what was called the New Zealand Muslim Association. This was the first Islamic agency operating in New Zealand. It was very small, very humble, operating out at the back of saying their prayers and conducting Islamic activities out of the back of someone's shop in the suburbs of Auckland. In the 1951 census, there were just over 200 Muslims in the entire country. And at the time, New Zealand only had about 1 million people, just to put things into perspective here. 1951, on the 1st of May 1951, a Norwegian refugee boat named the MS Goya made 3 trips to New Zealand and deposited hundreds of Eastern European refugees. Among them were many Muslims who would later become active members of the New Zealand Muslim Association. One of these, a gentleman called Mazhar Krasniki from Kosovo, an Albanian, would later serve as president of the New Zealand Muslim Association, and even more later on from that in 1979 would become the president of the first nationwide Muslim organization. But I'll talk about that in a little bit. I don't want to get too ahead of myself. In January 1956, the New Zealand Muslim Association in Auckland staged a formal congress in an effort to involve both Indian and European Muslims together. A gentleman called Avdo Musovic, a Slavic Muslim from Montenegro in Yugoslavia at the time, joined up and retired in 1980, only to retire in 1981. So far, this makes him the longest serving member of the executive committee of the New Zealand Muslim Association. And another curious footnote here, his son Miriam joined the New Zealand Air Force in 1969, making him the first Muslim to enter the New Zealand Armed Forces. A few years after this 1956 meeting, the New Zealand Muslim Association purchased a house to use for regular prayers and acquired the services of a mullah, a gentleman called Maulana Saeed Musa Patel from the Gujarat. So here we have the first Islamic centre and the first Islamic cleric in New Zealand, fully identified. The absence of halal meat led many Muslim immigrants and refugees to forge relationships with friendly Christian farmers who would allow them to slaughter livestock on their farms. Cross-confessional friendships were fostered, and over time, businesses established and developed. Across New Zealand, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, there was a marked increase in the number of foreign students from South Asia and Southeast Asia. Many of the beneficiaries of these scholarships were Muslims, and many chose to study at the new universities. However, their numbers and their contribution to the Muslim community fluctuated. And what this means is that certain towns and cities would have a lot of Muslim students, and then 3 or 4 years down the road, when they'd finished their qualifications, and returned home, there would be very few. So the numbers would fluctuate, and their input and contribution to the local Muslim communities would fluctuate as well. So sometimes this was useful and helpful. Sometimes it was itinerant, to say the least. Anyway, in 1963, Nazmi Mehmeti, an Albanian from Macedonia, who had arrived on the MS Goya, 1951, he secured the first specifically Muslim burial plot in Auckland at a suburban location called Waikumete, the Waikumete Cemetery. So this was the first ever specific Muslim burial plot. Before this, when Muslims died, and we have plenty of Muslims who died and they were buried up and down the country, they were just mixed with their non-Muslim neighbours and friends and communities where they died. Curiously, the first interment in the Muslim burial plot in the Waikumete Cemetery in the 1960s was a convert to Islam named Abdullah Qasim, or Victor Henderson. Sometimes people ask me who was the first convert to Islam in New Zealand, and so far as I have been able to identify, there were 2 brothers, the Marsack brothers from Auckland, who joined the British Air Force in the 1930s, and they were stationed in Egypt. And at some stage, they appear to have converted to Islam. They weren't active in New Zealand, so I don't know how much we should count that or not. But certainly, they were born in New Zealand and raised over here, and they figured in the local newspapers here in New Zealand. On the subject of conversion to Islam, the 1970s saw the formation of a group of Sufi devotees following a leader who styled himself as Sheikh Abdullah Isa Neil Dugan. Now, Neil Dugan had been a World War II soldier who travelled to Mecca in 1972 and published an account of his journey. This makes him the first and only account of a European New Zealander going on the Hajj to date. A few years after this, 1977, the Muslim Association of Canterbury was established in Christchurch. This was set up by Ismail and Suleiman Kara. Their grandfather had come from the Gujarat in the 1920s. 1979, going back to Auckland here, I'm just zipping about a little bit. In 1979, the New Zealand Muslim Association started work on the first purpose-built mosque in the country. Up until this point, all the Islamic prayers and services in this country had been held inside houses that had been converted for such use. The architect of the mosque, the first ever mosque in this country, was also a convert to Islam, associated with the Sheikh Abdullah Isa Neil Dugan group. And this was a chap named Abdul Salim Drake, who I believe is actually still alive, very elderly now. But that was 1979. That mosque was completed in 1981, and that's the first ever erected in New Zealand. It's worth emphasising that 1979 was a bit of a turning point in New Zealand Muslim history. According to the census figures, there was approximately 2,000 Muslims in the entire country. And they were scattered up and down the country, different regions. And then, as I mentioned briefly before, in April 1979, the Federation of Islamic Associations of New Zealand was created, and the first president was an Albanian Muslim refugee. In 1981, Sheikh Khalid Kamal Abdul Hafiz from central India came to New Zealand. He settled in Wellington, where he became the mullah. He soon became the senior religious figure to the Federation of Islamic Associations. In 1984, the Islamic Federation secured its first annual halal meat contract with the New Zealand Meat Producers Board. The halal certification program undertaken by the Federation allowed New Zealand to export meat and food to Muslim markets abroad, and contributing to the overall success of this country. It also allowed the Federation of Islamic Associations to have an independent source of income, issuing halal certificates in exchange for a little bit of money. This was controversial at the time, but it's taken as being fairly ordinary nowadays. Over 1985 to 1986, the Muslim Association of Canterbury in Christchurch built the first purpose-built mosque in the South Island on Deans Avenue opposite Hagley Park. This followed a $500,000 donation from Saudi Arabia due to the efforts of an enthusiastic Saudi Arabian student at the University of Canterbury. And this again comes back to the point I was making about the contribution made by the overseas students. It fluctuated and it was very erratic, but $500,000 is not something to be sniffed at. And that's basically why the Christchurch Mosque was erected. The 1990s saw a massive change to the size and shape of the resident New Zealand Muslim population. In 1987, the government changed the immigration laws quite considerably. Prior to 1987, the general emphasis had been to favour immigration from the British Isles. They really specifically tried to exclude people from Asia, Africa, but even also from continental Europe or North America. It was a very British-focused immigration policy. Then in 1987, the government decided to change this to open it up to more skills and education-based focus. So from the 1990s onwards, there was a considerable influx of people from Asia and Africa, which has changed the demographics in some way for the better, in some way for the worse. It's very controversial. I won't go into too much detail. Suffice to say, 1990 saw the creation, excuse me, I'll have some of my coffee. 1990 saw the creation of the Islamic Women's Council. This was deliberately created to give Muslim women in New Zealand a distinctive voice in the national community affairs. As I mentioned, there were several influxes of refugees from Bosnia, Somalia, Iraq, Kosovo through the 1990s. These added thousands to the numbers, and they were different from the 1950s refugees who came in as much as they were a little bit more needy than earlier waves, refugees, I should say. The first Muslim primary school was set up in Auckland. This was operated by the Tablighi Jamaat, which has its origins in the Gujarat, Western India. I won't go into too much details about that. the same organisation, the same group, basically, in South Auckland, set up a Muslim girls' college on the same road in South Auckland. Anyway, this change to the numbers of Muslims in New Zealand led to a huge proliferation of Islamic organisations, far too many to count, especially in Auckland. But it's enough to say that every single sectarian group you can possibly imagine in the Islamic world, from groups you've never heard of to ethnic groups you've never heard of, absolutely all are represented in Auckland at the moment. It's quite overwhelming, and I can't summarise it particularly well, not within a 3-hour speech. At the moment, according to the 2013 census figures, I'll stick with those because they're less controversial than the 2018 figures. The 2013 census figures said there were over 47,000 Muslims in New Zealand. Around 21% were born in the Pacific Islands, and I have to admit this is probably mostly from Fiji. 25% were born in New Zealand, 23% were born in Africa and the Middle East, and 26% were born in Asia. These 2013 statistics revealed that over 32,000 Muslims live in Auckland, so that's overwhelmingly the majority, and 20,000 Muslims in New Zealand identified as ethnic Asians. We have to take this as a bit of an elastic band here because the New Zealand census recordings are self-determined. So you put in when you're filling in the paperwork, you put down how you personally identify. It's not something that's assessed by an external authority there. So, and of course, you've got increasing intermarriage. So you've got people of mixed ancestry too. Anyway, on the 15th of March, 2019, last year, a terrorist attack was launched at the Masjid Al Nur in Christchurch and the Linwood Mosque, also in Christchurch. The gunman live streamed the first attack on Facebook. The attacks killed 50 people, injured another 50, including men, women and children. We're still living with this episode in recent history, so I don't have much to add here to say to this. It's a very well publicised incident. The last 12 months or so, I have been attending the Royal Commission that the government launched as a member of the Muslim Community Reference Group. And we've been meeting with the Royal Commissioners who have investigated this issue. And it's, it's been very emotional and very emotive, a very interesting episode in New Zealand history that we all wished had never happened. But unfortunately, we can't control that or regulate that. But that's certainly a page in New Zealand Muslim history now. I appear to have finished my speech, so I'll just tidy up with my conclusions here before any questions or answers come my way or start blathering on endlessly. The story of Muslims in New Zealand is a rich narrative demonstrative of tendencies that are both common to as well as divergent from patterns elsewhere in the former British Empire. In the final analysis, the cultural history of Muslims in New Zealand and Islam in New Zealand is an integral part of the rich and complex fabric of this country's past. When the recent terrorism travesty unfolded in Christchurch, it was immediately clear that there was an ongoing and underlying social tension. New Zealand Muslims are still negotiating their place and indeed the status of Islam within the complicated social hierarchy here. Questions and answers. So at this point, I got through that speech much faster than I thought I would. I should have written more. I wasn't too sure how much to blather. Too much. Sorry, Abbas. I've got through that really quickly, didn't I? I'll just quickly explain why I like looking at the biographies. I have to say, people often ask me, why do you go into so much detail with the biographies? And I always say, well, the biography, when you make a generalization and say the Indians set up a Muslim organization, that's a generalization. That's a low resolution analysis. When you go into the personal details and you look at this guy coming here, working hard, building a shop, putting money together, getting married, having a family, that's a high resolution analysis of the history of this country, of what's going on at a personal level. So I think that's very instructive and illustrative. So that's just a little footnote to the text there. Questions and answers. And I'll have another sip on my coffee and slow down a bit.
Thank you so much for this elaborate description, especially deep insight on history of New Zealand Muslims, first Muslims to the last incidents.
It's taken me 20 years of research, but I have actually tracked down the first Islamic center, the first mullah, the first person who stepped off a boat. I haven't actually managed to track all this down. It's quite bizarre, really. When you think usually when we talk about history in foreign countries, it's often very vague because it's something that happened hundreds of years ago. One of the fortunate features of New Zealand being a young country is that there's a lot of documentation for everything that happened. We're very, very fortunate in that respect. So we've even got the names of those two Indian Muslim sailors on the French vessel from 1769. One was called Nazreen, and the other one was called Mahmoud Qasim. It's remarkable the detail we've got on these guys. But nothing came of it. No one's named a ship or a town after them or a street or anything. But we have the detail, but for what it's worth.
It's great to get a person who have done 20 years research on the history of a Muslim community over the country. We are fortunate to get it. And we have a few questions, and I'll read it for you.
Sure.
The impact of this history on the present situation of Muslim in New Zealand.
That's a really good question, because as soon as we had the Christchurch travesty, there was a massive re-examination of the place of Muslims in New Zealand and their history. And I got a lot of phone inquiries, a lot of interviews, and you're talking about 1% or less than 1% of the population. But on the other hand, as I said, all of New Zealand is a small country. It's a rural economy. We export a lot of meat and food. So we're very reliant on selling foodstuffs around the world. So the halal certification of the 1980s, at the time it was very controversial because there were some people who objected. But on the other hand, it's we have to do business. We have to be able to, the consumer is always right. So there's this very complicated intersection and interplay between this very small Muslim minority issuing halal certificates to the freezing works, which is one of our major industries, exporting meat around the world. So they, I think at one point in the 1980s, we were exporting like 40% of our meat to the Middle East. Again, the numbers are fluctuating, they're different now. But 40%, we used to sell like 80-90% of our meat to Britain. Then Britain joined the European community, the EEC, which is now the European Union, and everything changed. And things are constantly changing. So the role and place of Muslims in New Zealand history has always been very quiet, very pacific. Just lots of men coming in and working very hard and building these little business empires and shops and running their little businesses and so forth. There's very few negatives. There are occasionally one or two episodes. I mean, I think I mentioned that guy from Oman, Muhammad Ali. I think I found a photograph of the chap in 1912. He was arrested by the police for being drunk and disorderly. So we actually have a photo of him from the Police Gazette. And, a lot of Muslims will lament this and say, well, he shouldn't have been drunk. Well, yeah, okay, no, he shouldn't have been drunk. But otherwise, we would not have a photograph of the guy. So it's complicated because I actually quite appreciate having the photograph. The photograph simply would not exist if he hadn't been picked up by the authorities. There's a lot of that sort of social problem in New Zealand, alcohol abuse. So it's actually, to me, it suggests that he was part of the society. He was quite integrated into the community in which he was living, better or for worse. So,
thank you so much. Because all these are from your research experience. You are looking very deep into these matters. There's another question. How do you describe the model of harmony and coexistence between Muslims community and larger society of New Zealand?
Yeah, well, I think there's a big lesson here about tolerance, patience. I hate to use those. There's a phrase inclusion, inclusivity, and diversity. They get used a lot the last 10 years. I've noticed, particularly by advocates of postmodernist philosophy. And I'm getting old myself, so I'm always a little bit wary about this. But I think there is certainly evidence for it in New Zealand history that. When Wazira, for example, in the 19th century came over and was working for an Anglo-Indian settler and stuff, there was no, I've not found much evidence for hostility. People talk a lot about race relations and so forth, but what I find is that, yes, you've got episodes of people experiencing racial abuse, but you've also got experiences of them marrying across racial lines. And we've got a lot of that in New Zealand. And because there's always been a great deal of intermarriage, what do you have to, in the bigger picture, the first 50 years of New Zealand history, there was European men outnumbered European women. So what happened is a lot of the European men who came to New Zealand as colonists, as settlers, they often married Maori ladies, the indigenous woman. And the next generation of European migrants would marry the half-caste daughters and so forth. And the half mixed race children, it was a very complicated social fabric. So yes, there was evidence of racial discrimination and some nasty, horrible episodes and some legislative framework you might question, but also there was a lot of intermarriage. And I find it very hard to believe that it was a deep-seated hostility between different groups. I just think it was. I don't want to trivialize it by saying it was jovial, but it was a very complicated social fabric. I mean, you find discrimination between the English and the Irish in New Zealand. A lot of it. So when you find discrimination between the different Maori tribes against each other, that's the indigenous population. So there's levels of discrimination at variant points, and I think it's unwise to generalize it all. But when it comes to history, I'm very hostile to the idea of goodies and baddies. There's very few cases in history where you have 100% baddies and 100% goodies. Usually you have some sort of mixture of, it's like a Shakespeare play. You have very complex characters unfolding in front of you. And this is, again, one of the reasons why I like the biographies, because you can see the complexities of these characters' lives when you view the full biography. Unfortunately, there is not a biography that stretches over 150 years, so you can't get the whole history of all of the New Zealand Muslims in one lifetime. But you can certainly get the general sense of it if you look more into those biographies. Does that make sense, or am I blathering a little bit at 5:30 in the morning?
Yeah, it's okay. Good. Let us look more into the harmony and coexistence. There will be this kind of.
Yeah. I think it's just always been there. To me, with my upbringing and my background, I always associate it with the whole British Empire thing. That was just something what we were brought up with. We grew up after the empire had ended, but my grandfather grew up in the 1920s and 30s, and he always talked. He was a beneficiary of the system, so he always thought of it very positively. Now, I went to a school that had a lot of Maori kids, so obviously they took a very different view. So I can see where they're coming from. It is actually a very complex story, and there were people who benefited from the system and people who were disadvantaged. But I think it's very complicated. So what happened in New Zealand was, I don't know if it was unique or just unusual or just peculiar to New Zealand, but certainly to me, the whole thing about the way in which people conducted themselves towards minorities and so forth was just part of that whole Anglo-Celtic heritage that we inherited. That's certainly my interpretation of my upbringing, of my perception of things. You just simply, it's just part of the values of the fabric of the countryside, and I just it's very complicated to explain where we got it from and how it's come by and how it's developed the way it has. But it is all tied up with that complex history of the country. I mean, I'll give you a good example. There's been a lot of discussion in New Zealand in recent years about studying New Zealand history. And then in the 1860s, there was a series of wars between the British authorities and the local Polynesian tribes called the Maori. After the wars were over, there was no sense of celebration. No one ever thought to celebrate the wars where the British defeated the Maori. No one ever thought to put up a big public memorial, something that, some giant statue or something. No one ever thought, to celebrate this. It was considered actually a negative that we'd had to have that fight in the first place, So like the whole culture to me that I grew up with was like, well, war is always bad and all of these things are bad. And, it's very quiet here in New Zealand and let's keep it this way, which is why, of course, the Christchurch mosque shootings are so unusual, because we do have a history of gun violence in this country, and it's usually people shooting their own ethnic group. It's very seldom that actually happens outside their own ethnic group. So you'll have gangs with certain ethnic populations shooting each other. You'll have farmers shooting each other over the fence. We've had massacres at Aramoana. That was 30 years ago now. That shows how old I am. Raurimu, that was 25 years ago. Those were quite some numbers killed. So we've had a history of gun violence and massacres and shooting in this country, but it's very quiet. We don't talk about it. We don't glorify these episodes of gun violence in New Zealand history. And there's a tendency in New Zealand as such not to study history, which is unhelpful. But the net result is that people don't talk about these issues much, and they're not very well known amongst New Zealanders, in my opinion. But then,
Thank you so much. Now we have a glorious history of coexistence and harmony in the country. And there are two other questions related to halal. Because you are talking about halal. I'll read the both one, and then you can answer for that. The economic factor, which has clear in halal industry, played a major role. Do you think that economy is a vital bringing faith communities together, closer? There's another one same related to that. What role do New Zealand Muslims communities and organizations play in establishing and promoting halal food industry in the country? How they are positioned in terms of New Zealand social fabric?
Yeah. So this is a really good illustration. To me, this is a really good illustration of that cooperation, because 99% of the farmers in this country would be either Christian or atheist of Christian heritage. But everyone understands that there is a reliance on exporting meat for our economy. It's absolutely critical. But you've got to remember, back in 1981 census, there was less than 2,000 or just over 2,000 Muslims in the whole country. There was a huge weariness about a small immigrant community having such an enormous hand on our economy. And so it was only through a series of negotiations. I think, as I said, the Islamic Federation was set up in 79. The first halal meat contract was 84. There was a great weariness. There was a reluctance to engage in debate, but there was also an awareness. People were alert to the fact that we needed to export meat, and the consumers wanted halal meat and foodstuffs and so forth. So this was critical. But there is actually a history to this already, because, as I said, when migrants' numbers started to go up in the 1950s and 60s, immigrants would just simply contact some local farmer, and they would agree to slaughter the livestock on the farm, and then cut it up, take it and refrigerate it somewhere and sell it or distribute it and so forth. So these relationships developed over a long period of time, and as I said, a little bit of intermarriage goes a long way. It's a very interesting story. It's a very interesting chapter in New Zealand history. I think the New Zealand Parliament has been having once a year. They don't do both Eid, but they'll do Eid. I think Eid al-Adha in the Parliament at least once a year for about the last 20 years. And it's no surprise to me that people from the New Zealand Meat Board and representatives of the food export companies are very keen to make sure that there's a good relationship between the New Zealand government and the Muslim community leadership. Now, the problem, as I suggested, is that the last 30 years, with the proliferation of Islamic organizations, you've had an increase in the number of different voices. And this has led to problems because it's not just a sectarian issue between Sunni and Shia or something, but you've also had issues where some people were not 100% satisfied that what was going on in the freezing works was halal, because some gentleman had come from a certain part of the world, or a village maybe, and their perception of how you do things in an industrial framework was very limited. And you have individuals who are coming over who don't have much education, and they would see things, they didn't like things, and they would just go and report it to the newspapers. And the newspapers, not knowing much about Islam or Muslims, would just sort of report to this guy as a great authority. One of the drawbacks about not having an established tradition of Islam, as you have in other parts of the world, is that anyone who presents himself to the newspapers or the radio or television, very frequently, up in the past, they would be taken as an authority. So, the newspapers would run off and talk to a taxi driver about the Ayatollah Khomeini, and this would be reported in the newspapers that, all the Muslims support him. And the mosque leadership would have to run off to the newspapers and say, well, no, it's not quite the case, but we don't want to oppose anyone. We don't want to get involved in political discussions. You know what I mean? So like, it's very interesting for me because I like going through the old newspapers, and the old newspapers are very, very instructive because you will see people being quoted in newspapers, and the next 2 or 3 days later, the mosque authorities, the local mosque authorities, will be very quick to change the story, the narrative, because they don't want to be associated with some political things that are going on overseas. They're trying to keep things quiet. But there is Muslim immigrants who are coming in and are very quick to run off to the newspapers and radio and broadcast their opinions about a number of complicated subjects and issues. And this being a Western country, an Anglo-Saxon country with its freedom of speech, people are allowed to do so. But the non-Muslim population is not, up until fairly recently, I'd say the last 12 months, things have changed radically. But up until fairly recently, the non-Muslim population was not very well informed about Islam or Muslims. And I can give you a story from history here. About 20 years ago, there was a chap on the east coast of the North Island here. He complained to the newspapers that he had purchased a pizza. It was supposed to be vegetarian, but he had discovered meat on it. And he claimed meat was not halal. Therefore, he complained to the newspapers and the radio. He said, and he was actually on national television. He said, according to his religion, Islam, he had to go on the Hajj for 40 days. He had to fast for 40 days, and he had to keep 40 meters away from non-halal food. Now, any Muslim will tell you straight away that this is nonsense. The guy had just made it up. I'm not saying that he was a liar. I'm just suggesting maybe he was less informed than he could have been, less educated than he might have been. But the newspapers, the television, and the radio, and the television, as I said, they were completely oblivious. They just took the guy at face value. He says that his religion has been, oppressed, tyrannized, or whatever, and they took it at face value because they simply don't know any better. And the Muslim community leaders were quick to rush to say, well, just it's not true. You don't have to go on the Hajj for 40 days and fast for 40 days if you've eaten non-halal meat. But that's the kind of incident that happens. I won't go into too much detail here, but it's the sort of thing that happens periodically in New Zealand. We're slowly getting better, but it is challenging. It is problematic, and we haven't had an episode like that recently, but it's a good illustration because it's 20 years ago. I don't think anyone else remembers apart from me.
Thank you.
Sorry, blathering on a little bit there.
These are good narrations, And
well, I think these personal stories are always very good as of illustrating those general tendencies, because generalizations can be very, very vague and woolly and meaningless. But when you bring it down to the personal experience, and that's why I like biographies, it gives the reader, the listener, it gives them a more informed perspective. People can relate to it and understand it a little bit better, in my opinion.
Yes, I really agree. That's the interesting things in your research that I found. You relate the personal things, and also integration is very important, as you mentioned. Those who come to New Zealand, they have to integrate with the local community. We have another questions, and I'll go to another one. The New Zealand government reactions after the Christchurch incidents made New Zealand a model for countering hate speech, supporting Muslim community. So how do you see it?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings because I live at the eye of the storm. My perception is different, obviously, from people who live thousands of miles away and looking from the outside in. I'm a little bit more cautious. I don't want to give a 2-hour lecture about New Zealand politics, but within the framework of New Zealand politics, I'm much more cautious. I can see the positives, and I can understand why people perceive it as positives, but I'm also slightly more cautious about these things. I'm very aware of New Zealand's history and the history between the left-wing parties and the right-wing parties. And all I can say politely is that I'm infinitely more cautious about these things. I don't want to sound like a negative Nelly, but I'm just extremely cautious. To me, a lot of these things come from it's just the way we were brought up. There are things you don't say and things that you don't do. And this was certainly in my upbringing. And that was before I converted to Islam. It was like, well, you just... adab, I think is the Arabic word, isn't it? Etiquette, behavior. You don't. I struggle to frame it properly. Sorry, I can't answer that question properly without another 2-hour lecture spell. You know, you need to understand the history of New Zealand politics, and I'd have to start all over again at 1840. That's a really big question, a really big question.
Just it was mentioning that your prime minister, she's an epitome of harmony. She has done a great job, and she was a model for the world. When the incident happened, she was embracing the victims of that incident. That was the harmony.
Yeah, so that's a really good example. So to me, that's the kind of thing that goes on in New Zealand before the Christchurch travesty. That was the sort of thing that happened in New Zealand. But that was just something the way we were brought up. That's what happened. When I was a kid, the gentleman in the house across the road shot himself in the head, and my mum went over there to console the wife and everything. It's just what people do here. I find it difficult to conceptualize any other way. When people say it's remarkable, I always sit there thinking very cautiously to myself, well, what else would the Prime Minister have done? What else would our political leadership have done? I know in other parts of the world things are a bit more grim, Burma and so forth, Myanmar. But in New Zealand, this is just simply the way things are. It's the way things have always been. And it's just part of the general upbringing I had. And I think it's just part of the New Zealand social fabric and social landscape. But then having said, Prime Minister comes from Morrinsville, and some of my family come from Morrinsville, so maybe there's some connection there. I don't know. I don't think so, but that was just part of the general culture we grew up with. Something bad has happened, you express remorse and you console the victims. Like I said, I'm just very, very cautious.
It was a great model, because all world, love to see those kind of good models from New Zealand, especially from the Prime Minister of New Zealand. There's another question. I think because of that, she came to power again. There's another question. Do you think that the New Zealand policy towards native people helped to creating an attractive, tolerant environment among the Muslims and others?
Yeah, that's another big question, because the policy towards the native population, this has been constantly evolving since day one, since the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, and then in 1841 the creation of the colony of New Zealand. It's been a constantly evolving process. There's been a constant process of negotiation and discussion. And as I said, there's been intermarriage from day one because of that surplus of European males in the 19th century, right up until I think about the 1900s. The numbers didn't rail out. But there's always been a degree of intermarriage and integration. But there's also been violence. There's also been wars. I mean, what we were just talking about gun violence. One of the biggest massacres, I think, was in the 1860s. A Maori chief called Te Kuti massacred a number of colonists. But when he massacred the 30 colonists, he also had to massacre 40 members of the local Maori tribe who were protecting them. So, it wasn't just a massacre of one group, it was a massacre of two groups. So, and again, that's part of the complex social fabric that's going on in New Zealand. People have said to me, the Christchurch Mosque massacre must have been the biggest massacre in the country's history. And I say, well, no, we've had bigger and uglier. But because we don't talk about it much, we don't celebrate this death and violence and blood and guts and so forth. And it's not well preserved, and the memories aren't well preserved and discussed much. So, yeah, it's a complex social fabric that's constantly being negotiated. I grew up in the Waikato region, which is like about 20% Maori, I think. And I went to a school which is about 10 years ago, they changed over to being a Maori language school. So the environment I grew up with was different from in the South Island, which is where the Christchurch Mosque shootings was. So it's different in different parts of the country. You've got to think of it like, I think there's a cliche to say it, isn't it? But it's like a multitude of competing but also collaborating social hierarchies across the land, across the topography. You've got all these groups that are working with each other, but also some that are grouping against each other, and they're all competing, but they're also collaborating. And it's a very complex bricolage, and it's worth studying. I think New Zealand history is really interesting. This is why I spent my life studying it. I think New Zealand Muslim history is a part of that complex fabric. I'll just give you one other anecdote just to illustrate the complexity of some of the stuff that's going on here. I was talking with one of the Maori gentlemen at work once, and he was complaining that we were having this argument that the European and the Maori New Zealanders, we have a lot of arguments, like a husband and wife. We have a lot of arguments amongst ourselves. And at one stage, he was saying about racism in New Zealand, and he said that Maori people were not allowed social welfare in this country until 1935. And I said, well, that's not an example of racism. And he said, well, why is that not an example of racism? I said, well, because social welfare wasn't introduced until 1935. You know, it's if you follow New Zealand history with your eyes open and you're paying attention, the 1935 Social Welfare Act was introduced. It was applicable to all citizens and residents in the country. But the perception that, oh, our grandparents only got social welfare after 1935, that doesn't mean that people were getting it before 1935. It just means that, you know, and then the question, he throws back a question to me, well, how did people survive? And I said, well, they struggled. That's why your great-grandparents were struggling. My great-grandparents were struggling. Well, you know, one of my great-grandparents grew up in an orphanage in New Zealand. You know, this isn't a wealthy country with gold or oil or diamonds on the beach like in Namibia or something. Got diamonds on the beach. You know, no, this is actually a very small country in the South Pacific, limited resources, geography that's like a million miles away from anywhere. The wealth that's created here is generated through lots of individuals, such as these Indian shopkeepers and hawkers and whatever, men working hard. You know, and the fact that some people struggle is reflective of that geography and economy and so forth. And it's very easy to see why people sort of misinterpret this, because a lot of people don't study history in New Zealand. This is one of our problems. But I think that's a really perfect episode. You know, like 1935 Social Welfare Act. Well, how did people? You know, it's a really good example. And that discussion I had with well, I won't say his name, but yeah, a gentleman.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Especially giving your 20 years long research.
You're too kind. You're too kind.
Your research, you know, because it's interesting to hear, you know, how the country developed and the Muslims were part of that and the halal, everything.
Yeah. It's been a remarkable whirlwind. You got to think of it like one of those American roller coaster rides. You know, like when the European settlers first turned up here. It's not like when the British went to India and there was already cities and towns and developed agriculture. When the Europeans first came here, the standard of living amongst the Polynesian tribes was hunting, gathering, and I think the only agriculture they had was kumara, which is like kind of potato. Literally it was very, very, very rudimentary. And the British the British colonists had to build a modern nation state. And in 100 years, they did quite a lot of things. Now, they made a lot of mistakes. They had a lot of ugly policies. There's no denying that. It's a complex story. But when I look at it, I say, well, Muslims were part of that story. Whether anyone likes it or not, there've been Muslims here since the 1850s, one way or the other. So it's part of that complex story.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this, especially for giving a good anecdote and also the history of Islam, New Zealand. And hope we will have more time in future together with the World Muslim Community Council. I thank you for
Inshallah. Shukran jazeelan. Kalas.